Students often think that centering needs to be some kind of perfect activity. Centering is highly overrated, and you shouldn't spend a lot of time on that part. Your job is to make interesting shapes, not center a lump of clay. This obviously isn't round, but I'm going to show you that it almost doesn't matter. Even if I do everything wrong, I can make something out of this piece of clay. So let's just go ahead and do everything incorrectly. This is probably not the ideal way to start out making a pot, but I'm going to go ahead and just poke a hole in here and see if I can center the clay. Looks like trouble. But the most powerful part of centering isn't making a ball of clay on the wheel, it's making the wall section. So if I grab onto the donut of clay and make the wall section even, I can make something out of even an irregular shape of clay. So it'll take me a minute to fix this piece of clay, but I will be able to make something out of it. It's not perfect at the top, but that's okay too. It's possible to cut this clay off. One way is to use your wire tool. If you're going to do that, you want to hold your thumbs as close as you can to the rim of your piece. I oftentimes support the rim at the same time as I cut it, but hold the wire tool still, press down until it's below where it's crooked, and then lift up. Notice that I wasn't rushing to do that. Many beginning students kind of push down and cut and the top becomes irregular again. So hold still, press down, and then lift off. Now the top's even. This piece is a bit wobbly because the clay that I picked up wasn't smooth either. It's harder on one side than the other from the bag being open. I'm going to describe throwing with either the side of your hand or the end of your fingertips. In either case, I'm using my fingertip. I use these methods of throwing interchangeably, and it's important to see what is different. My inside hand is almost always exactly the same. I put my hand straight into the vessel and let my fingertips bend. This relaxed position allows me to lift the clay. If you bend your fingers and pull like against a horizontal surface, that's too much friction. So just by letting my fingertips relax, it's the correct orientation. My outside fingertips will either look like this or like this, and my thumb will connect as much as I possibly can. So we'll open up the ball of clay and I'll demonstrate throwing with your fingertip and the side of your finger. So open the ball of clay, compress the bottom, make an inside corner, recenter the donut of clay. Maybe begin to taper it so it's easier to cone. Get the clay wet. Squeeze with your thumb, get under the clay, and then lift like the human claw. So I'm lifting the clay between my fingertips on the inside and my thumb on the outside. Leave the rim a little bit thicker than the wall below. Recenter the clay at the top. Cut some clay away so you can get your fingertip under without grinding off your fingernails. Get the clay wet inside and out. Maybe slow the wheel down a little bit. I find it easier to move large amounts of clay with the side of my finger. I can adjust how much of my finger touches by twisting my wrist and by raising and lowering my elbow. So either way controls what touches, but basically I lift up the clay with the side of my fingertip. If there's a great big piece of clay on there, I can lift up the clay with the whole edge of my finger. This part of your finger is almost like a rib, so that when you're throwing, you can lift the clay here and shape the clay there. For now, the first pull, I'm just going to touch with the end of my fingertip. So get underneath a little bit of clay, get it wet, lift a little, push the clay out, and then lift straight up. You can see that only this end of my fingertip is touching. Many people call this throwing with your knuckle, but my knuckle isn't touching the clay. My outside hand, the clay is going up a ramp. If you bend your hand flat, the clay comes down and has to make a sharp corner here. If your fingertip is at an angle, the clay is going up a ramp gently. This is the least amount of friction. So I'll get the clay wet inside and out. Cut a little bit of the clay from the bottom to get underneath it again. So this time I'll switch from the side of my finger to the end of my fingertip. The easiest way to describe this fingertip method is the heels of my hands are parallel to each other. So my fingertips are pointing toward each other as well. This is a little more difficult mechanically because as I lift, I have to lift from my shoulder. I can only go about this far before I run out of travel in my shoulder. It's very important not to roll your wrist and change where your fingers are touching the clay. So I'll press in at the bottom, pick up a little bit, deform the clay a little, and then lift straight up. You can see that just my fingertip is touching. If I need to let go in order to moisten the clay again, it's just hold still while the wheel makes one revolution, and then you can let go. I can rejoin where I was before and begin lifting again. The less you touch the clay, the less friction there is, and the less likely your pot is going to twist or torque on the wheel. It's important to throw gently more than by mashing the clay around. I'm going to talk about how your arm bends, the mechanics of how you're going to lift the clay. If you have something that's this tall, you need to be able to maintain the same hand position as you lift the clay. In order to throw with my fingertips, I need the heels of my hands parallel to each other. So as I go to lift a tall cylinder, I'm picking up the clay with my shoulders. I'm picking up my hands with my shoulders. There's a point where I can't go any higher, and it's important not to bend your fingers if you can avoid it as you're throwing. Many potters who throw with their fingertips begin in this position, and as they lift the clay, roll their fingertips around. For beginners, this is pretty hard to figure out, so I'm going to recommend that you try and keep the heel of your hand as close to the pot as you can. Once you get higher than about here, though, you have to do something different. That's one of the reasons why I typically throw with the side of my hand or the side of my finger. It's possible to start with your elbow on your leg and lift a little bit and then pick up your elbow in your arm. Mechanically, this is very easy to do. My shoulder muscles are very strong and I'm moving the clay with the strongest muscles of my arm rather than just by bending my fingertips. So mechanically, this is very effective at lifting the clay. What I think is difficult for many people to figure out, again, is what is moving. Many beginners try and lift the clay by rolling their wrist, which will make that shape on the potter's wheel. So my suggestion is lift your elbow up in the air. Make your elbow move. So my forearm in the angle of my wrist isn't really changing very much when I lift with my shoulder. I think that'll help you to be able to lift taller pieces with the least amount of difficulty.